My name is Linda Shai. I'm an associate professor in the department, and I could not be more delighted to welcome our speaker today, Barbara Summers. And Barbara came from Lakewood, which is a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, so I like to think that all good things must come out of Cleveland, as you are beginning to find out. And she graduated from the MRP program here in 2014, and I think she really exemplifies her work since then, and the work that she's going to present today really exemplifies so many things that we care about in this Department of City and Regional Planning. So her topic today is going to be about informality and about legitimacy, and it touches on so many of the questions that we have raised already in our classes so far in the semester. When we think about formality and informality, these are two sides of the same coin, this kind of relationship of what counts as being legitimate and what counts as being illegitimate. And the case she will present today is a situation where the government itself, rather than considering how do we better support our residents, how do we actually then steal the land upon, not steal, but how do we contest the land and remove people from places where they are living, right? So who has rights to the city? Who has a right to government support? And what do you do in the face of your government actually being against you rather than supporting your particular interests? As you think about these issues, some of you may or may not care about Nigeria or informality, but I think the issues that she is raising today really touch upon so many of the places that you may care about. This question of the center and the periphery, whose knowledge actually counts. When you are challenging the conditions that you find in the city, is the dominant kind of discourse and the set of knowledges we already know likely to solve the problems? I think it was Einstein who said, we cannot solve problems with the same mindset that we had when we created the problems in the first place. So she has not only considered the challenges, but also gone further to think about what are the real inspirational stories of resistance and of change. And so since graduating from our program, she has had an illustrious career working for the last 11 years for groups like the World Bank, GCOM, I2UD, which I also worked with, GGGI, the Nature Conservancy, Oxfam, among others. And she has since gone to work for the Collaborative Media Advocacy Platform in Nigeria, which is a consortium of a community-based organization that really begins to communicate on behalf of the residents who are there to provide information, to provide data, and to give voice to people who may be voiceless. And so she is the director of spatial research and strategies for them. So I think that she really exemplifies our program in caring about the issues that she does, in translating our theories for more ethical practice into the kind of work and the organizations that she works for, and then coming back to share with us how she has managed to do so. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Summers.
Hi, can you guys hear me? I just switched on the microphone. Perfect. First of all, it is great to be here. It feels like just yesterday I was sitting in those seats watching other speakers, so a little surreal in that way. And as Linda mentioned, I work with CMAP, Collaborative Media Advocacy Platform, which is kind of the supporting arm to our local grassroots community organization, the Chicoco Collective. To just give you a little bit of context when I refer to CMAP or Chicoco Collective. A couple other things before I get into it. I'm gonna, for simplification, refer to we. And in that case, I'm not just referring to myself, but referring a lot to our members of the Chicoco Collective and community members, so across the board. And with that, I will kind of get started a little bit. So Chicoco Collective is a human rights media advocacy, urban planning and design project. And I know that sounds like a lot, but I'll get into through this presentation how all of those things are kind of interlinked. So we are based in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, which is, I know as planners we love maps and be able to locate things, so I threw some in for this. We are based in Port Harcourt, which is kind of one of the largest city in the Niger Delta. Just for context, it's Lagos is on the other side of the coast, closer to Benin. And as I said, we are the largest city in the Niger Delta. And this is, and I'm going to give you, Port Harcourt is a city that doesn't really have a good reputation. But this is something we are trying to change and kind of take hold of that. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background and context about the region in Port Harcourt, because I don't really think you can talk about our project without kind of understanding the issues that it's responding to. So this region has been kind of a place for the export of dark cargo, starting way back with human beings, to palm oil, to coal, and now crude oil. And it's a city that has kind of been carved out of a tangle of creeks in the delta for the export of a deep water port for the export of coal in 1913 during the British colonial occupation. This is actually the first map of Port Harcourt, ostensibly drawn as an independent nation in 1962. But if you look really closely here, you can actually see down in this corner that all of this comes from shell, aerial, and ground surveys. So kind of deeply rooted in this region is the extraction of oil and this is, this region has been marked by decades of extraction and environmental degradation. And just kind of to give you some context of the scale of this, there is the equivalent of one Exxon Valdez oil spill per year in the Niger Delta. And I really like to use this photo to kind of highlight the deep structural inequalities in the Niger Delta. In the background here, you have a Chevron natural gas facility. And as they are actually extracting the resources from the ground in the background, this community you see in the front is actually subsiding and disappearing into the water. And this kind of brings us back to Port Harcourt itself. And just, another map for a little bit of context. This is a map of kind of the built-up area of Port Harcourt. It is kind of sprawling into the creeks and very oddly shaped. And the city is ringed by these informal waterfront settlements. And these have very poor access. They are quite invisible from the upland areas, being actually 10 to 15 meters below the rest of the upland areas. You can actually see some of the colonial grid still there. And kind of what was called the native barracks areas have become a lot of these waterfront communities. And these communities are infilled mangroves. I was looking for a good picture, but this one will do for now. And they are made from what we call Chicoco mud, which is what you see, these big fibrous blocks that are kind of cut out of the mangroves. You can also see them kind of in the background being held up as they're building land, and they mix them with solid waste to create new land and replace the mangroves. And these kind of over years, and you can even see the foundations being built as they're doing this. And there's one of our members of our team kind of actually mapping that foundation. So these waterfront settlements are home to a third of the inhabitants of the city, over 500,000 people, and yet there are no government services in these communities. And these communities are really characterized by severe water pollution, air pollution, no sanitation, extrajudicial policing, and very stark inequalities. And these communities have really not been included or considered in any of the formal city plans. In fact, in 2009, the city came up with a brand new master plan. This is kind of the land use map of that part of that plan. And through that plan, you can see in kind of green, they placed all of these waterfront settlements as open space and marked them for demolition. And it kind of imagined the city as this kind of bizarre Dubai-esque petro-utopia. I don't know if you can see where anyone might actually live in this kind of design. And it's really kind of divorced from and disillusioned with these real urban realities on ground, where majority of the people in the city live. And this has led to a situation where forced eviction and demolition has become kind of the core urban development policy. And to kind of showcase what this looks like, I'm going to show a short video that is of an Injumanzi waterfront community in 2009, when the government came in with no warning, no compensation, and over 19,000 people lost their homes in a single weekend. And this was kind of the triggering moment to start our project. So here you go.
They came 7:30. They came with their bulldozers and they came with their soldiers.
Yeah, this way. Front, we come and go front. Forward. Step side. That side, then go this side. Police on that side, you cannot come this side. Come this way. This way.
Come inside. Come and see. After demolishing my place, I don't have where to stay. I hung around for 2 weeks. No money. I don't expect that day they will come and demolish that place with somebody. So now I hang around with my children, with 6 children. I hang around, I don't have a place to stay. Even if I have money to pack my things to play, I don't have. Me, I'm not a lazy woman. I'm not a criminal, I'm not a militant. I'm a struggling woman. I do business. I do petty trade, rice, beans, tomatoes, I sell. I go to and buy things and sell. I'm not a lazy woman. I'm an industrious woman. I do business. I'm a struggling woman. And now the government frustrates me. There's no way to. Even all my property was scattered, my things, my business was scattered. No way to now to start even the business. No way to manage. No way even to put my children in the school. That place is our home, where we brought up. Are we supposed to be in refugees in our own lands?
And when you see kind of these images of this demolition just like this without context, you could very well think this could be a natural disaster. You know, a hurricane, a tsunami, the devastation here of losing your home. But this is a political decision. And our first kind of immediate response of this is to get people out in the streets to protest, to raise awareness. This is in Port Harcourt, and we also partnered with Amnesty International on a global campaign as well, called People Live Here. And as part of that in Port Harcourt, we put up these billboards around town that, you know, quite simply trying to say, these are not open space, people live here, and showcasing different residents of the waterfront communities. You know, this is Sunday, who's a fisherman from Amatari Polo. I've met him, he's delightful. And the government did not like this at all. This billboard actually lasted 24 hours before it was torn down by the government. You may actually recognize Prince. He was the one kind of directing the video you saw, and he is part of this campaign as a resident of Injumanzi. He's actually now one of our lead cinematographers, so. And this led us to launch kind of what do we do from this space of just responding to crisis. And this led us to kind of launch what we call the Human City Project, because people were really ostensibly missing from any of the previous plans. And we started with cinema, which may not be the obvious starting place at all, especially for us planners. But we found that cinema was a really good way of kind of gathering people, animating them, kind of creating debate. And the camera, actually, that you saw in the evictions, you saw people directing that. They recognized the importance of documenting what was happening, showing what was happening. And actually that day, our project director, Michael, who was filming, actually was arrested during that demolition. And the community members smuggled out his camera and film and brought it back to him. And that actually is the footage that created that short video that was shown kind of across the world as part of that campaign. And we've shown films about forced evictions around the world and in their own communities. As you can see here, the community this screen is in is the community on the screen. And we also have this really fun inflatable cinema projector, which allows us to get really creative about where we can show films. Our radio program came out of, asking communities who have been threatened by this what was most important to them, and it was to have a voice. So quite literally, community radio. And radio is still one of the dominant forms of media, but most of the news comes from kind of top-down radio stations. So there was this real desire to kind of have a community radio to tell their stories. And we asked residents to send representatives from all sorts of community. Tons of people showed up. And we spent a long time kind of training people to be radio technicians, on-air personalities, producers, how to conduct interviews, and really focused on building their capacity to tell their stories. And we also include what we call actually thinking inside the box, where we teach people how to maintain and kind of repair all of their equipment to kind of build their long-term capacity to do this. And our music program actually started quite organically out of people, in this radio studio creating jingles for fun. And now it's kind of expanded into a large established program, really focused on the, music and movement making and how that kind of supports that, which there is a deep history of that in Nigeria. And now we bring in a lot of international musicians to work with our team. Show some photos at least of this. And it's now kind of expanded to have a large 20-piece band that we do performances and is performed at kind of large music festivals, including Celebration in Lagos several times. And now we're working towards a recording contract and distribution contract, which is very exciting. Soon, Spotify, not yet. And our mapping program, which is the program I directly lead, but I should say we're a small team, so everyone has their hands in a little bit of everything. Started out of directly wanting to show that people live in these communities and have prove that they're not open space and have data to back up what they're saying, which they didn't previously have any of this. And quite literally putting their communities not recognized on any formal map on the map. And we did a lot of training from basics of understanding how to read a map to a lot of training of how to conduct surveys, how to understand infrastructure, how to use data collection instruments, a lot of time doing that. And we have started indexing through our pilot every individual structure in a household in these communities, documenting the infrastructure, gathering details such as population, topography, land use, employment, health. So very deep kind of census style data collection. And we even have done a lot of training on data entry and QGIS, and we use QGIS because it's very important for us to use kind of free open software that anyone can use and they continue no matter what. And all of this is fed back into a database that residents can refer to when dealing with authorities, security forces, or nonprofits or other organizations that kind of want to work with them on development projects, et cetera. And these have now created some of probably the deepest data sets of any community in the Niger Delta, if not wider, in Nigeria. And they're really representative of kind of diverse waterfront communities. And these are, I always say the waterfront communities are not a monolith. There's kind of quite a diversity of who lives, what the communities are like. And also really focusing on telling the story of challenging the narratives of what is said about their communities. I said there's no government services, but they have vast networks of self-built infrastructure networks that they are building, preparing, funding themselves. And also changing the story about who lives there. How many, there are PhD holders in these communities, there are doctors, there are, people have been living in some cases greater than 40, 50 years in these communities. These aren't new, didn't pop out of nowhere. And even in one of these communities, Amatari Polo, we found that actually 12% of the residents were actually civil servants. So these are the government staff. So when they're demolishing them, they are actually the people that work in the government. This is where your average person lives. And all of these are presented back to the community. We print them on these giant banners that kind of are put up that anyone can come and interact with and kind of tell them more about what is in this data and how they can use it. It's actually really fun. People are usually really excited when they can find their house on a map for the first time. This man, recognized his index code sticker that had been stuck on his house and was able to find his house on the map. Or these kids were very excited to find their school. And we started this pilot process through a very intensive process, capturing very detailed information, doing household surveys from 70 to 90% of households in these communities. But we've now embarked in a journey to kind of put every waterfront community on the map through what we call our rapid profiling program. And by doing this, we will have a base level of information for all waterfront communities, and this can help us make informed plans for continuing our mapping, and also prioritizing communities that we think are more at risk for demolition or other issues. And here you can actually see our team mapping the boundary between two communities, which is this drainage canal. And we have these very rugged tablets because we have dropped them and things like this. And we have a GPS antenna, our Bad Elf antenna, that has actually greatly improved our accuracy of collecting GPS points. Because these are very dense communities. Moving from less than 10 meters accuracy to less than 1 meter is huge when structures are less than a meter apart. And as I mentioned, we capture the boundaries, all of the structures, the key community assets, and kind of communal infrastructure through this process. And we also capture, with our drone, very detailed high-res drone imagery that allows us to really improve our accuracy of tracing structures, et cetera. We also hold focus groups in the community to capture the community histories, key events that have happened, how they were settled, and things like that. And they're all brought together into these community profiles. Here's a couple different profiles of communities. And they're all presented back to the community through a handover process and kind of go through how they might be able to use them. We've actually mapped a good portion of the city's self-built settlements. We've done 54 communities so far. We actually have 9 in progress right now that will kind of help fill that gap between those two areas right there at the tip of Port Harcourt. And we even map and tell the story about the demolished communities. We have our own rapid response team that is a combination of our journalists and mappers that captures kind of the spatial realities of forced evictions. With our drone imagery program, we're able to, capture before and after of these mass demolitions. These are communities that were demolished actually in 2022. and able to show what structures were there before. And these can kind of data can serve as community testimony, as evidence of assets destroyed. This was us kind of logging the days. This was over about a 4-day period where they came in and demolished all of these 10 communities. You can kind of see the 3 days. The first day was small because their actually bulldozer broke down. So they didn't get as far, which they call a swamp buggy. And I'm actually very excited to say that this mapping data was actually used in recent litigation for these 10 communities. And they just actually in March won a huge case against the government where they did declare this demolition illegal and are awarding substantial compensation to the residents. So that's huge. They're still hugely displaced and affected, but it is a huge step to have that recognized. And mapping is just part of our media advocacy program. We share a lot of this out on live when these events are happening on social media and things like that. And we've also do a lot of thinking, how can we help communities use this data and understand it? And how can we activate this data? And one of the tools that we use is we call our Encounter and Exchange program. We bring government agencies, local NGOs, security forces, residents all together in the community that we've mapped with the data. And these are often entities that have quite antagonistic relationships. So this is a really big deal. And they usually don't enter the waterfront communities. So holding them in the community and really focusing on how to use this data to have solution-focused discussions, not just focusing on the issues. And in this case, we actually have some young boys with police officers, and this is typically, not a very good relationship. I mean, I think not anywhere, but especially in Port Harcourt. And they're kind of showing different hotspots in the community and highlighting where their concerns are. And actually through our data, we were able to show that these communities are actually quite safe. There's really low crime within these communities and kind of challenge that narrative that's often said these are dens for criminality, hoodlums only live here. In another Encounter and Exchange, we had a really good discussion where the community vigilante group was actually talking with the police officers about how to formalize their relationship. Can they be recognized with their walkie-talkies? How can they work together when something happens and change that relationship? And actually in another community that we held an Encounter Exchange, we were able to show through our mapping data that collectively households spend about 18 million naira or $5,000 per year on drinking water, buying that, their own, paying for their boreholes, et cetera. And so the community actually decided we could use that money, and they're kind of installing a solar-powered borehole in their community with treated water that they hope will greatly reduce their drinking water costs and also have safe, treatable water. As you've seen, we're pretty in the trenches, down on the ground, working, day to day. But I want to take us back a little bit to 2020, the pandemic, which hit. We all felt it. We kind of were scrambling to say, how do we continue what we're doing when the city is locked down? So the first thing that we did is we started our program called Walk Up Past My Window, quite literally capturing the stories of how people were impacted from their windows and able to distribute microphones and things to our different team members throughout the waterfront communities. And we quickly, as we were doing this, kind of realized that there was real considerable concern about what was happening in the Global South in the pandemic, but the stories and impacts were really underrepresented in the mainstream media and didn't really capture how the pandemic was exacerbating all these existing inequalities, the public health and service delivery crises that have existed long before the pandemic. So we decided to launch our Viral Times platform. I'm just going to play a short video that was kind of our launch to this.
During the hard times, dark time. Would I be singing? Yeah, yeah, that was singing. Yeah, about the dark times. Yeah, in the dark time. Would I be singing? Yeah, yeah, that was singing. Yeah, about the dark times. Yeah. It's hard to make a living, but we live. That's how we gon' make it through the pandemic. The cash in house that rally was locked. Politics is now a form of fraud. Black suits in the air, I breathe. The poor stays, but the rich get richer. I choose not to be enslaved by situations and decisions that I make. Yeah, in the dark time. Would I be singing? Yeah, yeah, that was singing. Yeah, about the dark times. In the dark time. Would I be singing? Yeah, yeah, that was singing. Yeah, about the dark times. Story, story, story. A monkey stole some money in Nigeria, about $1 million. Then he called his G. Snaky, snaky. Even you can cash out 36 with no P. All you need is guards, security and SARS. Fly your kids to France. And power talks for killing of the opposition parties. Power to the people, by the people, and for the people. That's why when the people travel out, they turn flying eagles. Never to come back. Why? In the dark time. Would I be singing? Yeah, yeah, that was singing. Yeah, about the dark times. Yeah. In the dark time. Would I be singing? Yeah, yeah, that was singing. Yeah, about the dark times. Yeah.
Surely no one is singing.
So fun, that's an original song by our team. I should also note that that community was actually one of the communities that was demolished in 2022. So that community is no longer standing. But this is what the platform looks like. I encourage you to go check it out, and there's a lot on there. And we started thinking about what can we use using our data collection and mapping skills to tell the stories of what's happening. And this was a story that we actually mapped how, as formal markets were shut down, people were really caught between hunger and disease, and informal night markets actually sprung up to replace these in the waterfront communities. So these marginalized neighborhoods actually during this time became these like really valued commercial centers, flipping a lot of how these areas were seen. We also looked at how to use kind of our existing mapping data to tell the story. You know, what does it mean to social distance in a slum where you share your toilet with 500 of your neighbors? Or if you and your family live in a single room and your family is less than 1 meter from, or your neighbors are less than 1 meter from you. Kind of, skews all of this 2 meters. We also told stories about, the government palliative programs. I kind of put this in quotes because it was pretty much nothing. This was a story told by one of our trainees' younger brothers about how the government drove around with a pickup truck and were quite literally just tossing instant noodle packets from the back of their truck, and people were scrambling up and elbowing and fighting to access those. So that was kind of the extent of that. We also captured what was happening, what sprung up during the same time, which was kind of the End SARS movement, which in this case doesn't refer to COVID, ironically during the same period, but it was a grassroots youth-led movement against the very corrupt and violent Special Anti-Robbery Squad, aka SARS. So there's a lot more stories that I recommend in things that you check out. And that was kind of our first foray into kind of online platforms. We're now working on what we call our narrative geographies map-based storytelling program that brings a lot of our spatial data with all of these stories. And it allows you, we hope to make it really useful for communities on ground, and also a space that people nationally and even internationally, people like you, can kind of interact and understand the dynamics in these communities. That will allow you to kind of pick through different communities, look through the survey data, the different infrastructure networks. Also kind of have a story mode where you can, follow through different, if you're interested in sanitation issues, you're interested in power and electricity, or forced evictions, et cetera. Or you could follow kind of a character in there every day, like favor a young mom, a member of the mapping team, a biology student, as she kind of moves through her day and what she interacts with. And there's a lot of different media, written articles, videos, et cetera, and even bringing in kind of 360 street view imagery so you can actually walk through and engage with a lot of this. And throughout this, I've kind of really we've focused a lot on specifically the waterfront communities. And we've done what we like to refer to kind of as scaling deep. And really, instead of just scaling up, really building the local capacity to engage with these issues, challenge them, and then also begin to engage and kind of have citywide impact. One way that we actually first started to kind of bring issues to the forefront and create a citywide dialogue was through a radio drama. And we kind of set this in a fictional waterfront community. And you can actually see them mapping that community here. What would it sound like when a character moves from the school to the market? What would you see? Using a lot of that. And we did this through really intense research. We did, community visits, focus groups, really asking communities what are the issues they want to talk about if they experienced. The first season covered issues of police impunity and brutality, and forced evictions, as well as other issues like child marriage. And these were broadcast citywide with discussion sessions. We brought in experts to kind of engage with, and we had really engaging call-ins and things. We even had a police officer call in at one point to talk about, his experience with bribery and things like that. Our second season actually covered was more spatialized, covering issues facing women in waterfront communities, including sanitation issues. What does it mean for a woman to use the long drop public toilet at night? She doesn't, because it's not safe, and highlighting those realities. And we really focused on kind of making this idea of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, and setting these issues in these kind of fictional but yet very real waterfront communities. People were able to engage and discuss them in a very unique way that they wouldn't have otherwise. You had people saying, yes, this happened to me. I'm able to, you even saw one thing that was said in one of the episodes was like, is police your friend? And all of a sudden you saw that being discussed throughout the city, which was really cool to see that. And another way that we have tried to catalyze change is through pilot interventions, such as our community space, aka Chicoco Shed. Creating kind of a learning garden and inclusive community space powered through renewable energy. And we are actually in the process of actually renovating this structure right now, so it's going to be much nicer and better. And we really want to meet community needs and wants, but also challenge spatial norms. Create a space for women, because most public spaces in these communities are for men or children. So challenging that. This was actually a case where we had our band performing, led by women, performing a feminist version of a Fela Kuti song, No Agreement, the audience here was a group of community leaders who are all men. So it was actually a very empowering and something that wouldn't happen otherwise. And we want to create a space that is flexible for different events, can hold screenings, used as the community town hall, and this space was actually donated by the community to us, tore down their existing structure to kind of use this space. And also, very importantly, a light at night for safety, which is very important in a place where you're lucky if you get 8 hours electricity a day. And we have grand plans to expand this and turn this into a bigger community media center that will be able to host all of our programs. And we've gone through a very rigorous participatory design process to do this. And we hope that this will be kind of, the most iconic structure in the city that just happens to be in a waterfront community, and challenge that where people come into the waterfront to, see this architectural iconic structure. So I'm going to switch a little bit. Back in 2017 was actually the first time we worked at the city scale on the very sexy World Bank funded fecal sludge management project. I learned a lot about shit, more than I ever thought I would ever know. And this was part of a larger World Bank and African Development Bank funded water and sanitation project in the state. And we were contracted by the World Bank through a partnership with an American NGO that works on water issues. And we were the local data collection arm for this project to carry out this kind of citywide assessment of fecal sludge. And this was actually a really big deal for us. You know, the idea that these kind of slum dwellers were actually collecting the data that is being analyzed by international experts in the World Bank, and that will inform citywide development and service delivery. And this was kind of a huge step for our team to be kind of recognized and also challenge them to think about how rigorous their data collection process is. This isn't one for their neighbors, this is for, you know, experts out there. And actually, most importantly, actually, the original project design, this is just some images of that process. There's a whole lot more images of what we did, but the original project design actually didn't include waterfront communities, but yet the project had this goal to reach 1.5 million people citywide. And with our mapping data, we were able to say, you can't do that unless you include waterfront communities. And since then, the project has been revised, and waterfront communities actually became a focus of this project. And actually, as we speak here, there actually are installing water pipelines into waterfront communities to deliver potable water. We'll see how the success of this is, but that's a huge step of kind of challenging how bringing development into the communities. And while our work has focused on Port Harcourt, it doesn't mean that we can't use our research and our voices to kind of have a broader global influence. Many marginalized communities are dealing with the exact same issues. And over the past few years, we have really worked to publish a lot more of our work. This is a publication that came out just this summer on the kind of niche topic of the impacts of climate change on children in informal settlements. There's a lot on children in cities, there's a lot on impacts of climate change, but kind of not this weird nexus of these three things. And we really feel strongly that the research and policy discussions on communities like Port Harcourt's informal settlement should be driven by the people living there. So, and you'll note actually that two of our waterfront residents and members of our mapping team, Michael Dede and Prince Nasa, are co-authors of this. For them, that is really huge to be recognized in this way, and that they are increasingly have a number of publications out there that they are part of and are driving that kind of those stories. And as part of this research, we conducted a lot of focus groups with children and caregivers and community leaders to document their lived experiences and kind of further amplify their voices. These are just a couple of the quotes that we collected, covering issues of how flooding affects them on their day-to-day or heat waves. And, you know, when you talk to people, they're very aware and, you know, talking about how things are changing, climate change is affecting them, and what are their coping mechanisms. And we're actually really excited that this research was just a few months ago presented to the lead authors of the forthcoming IPCC special report on cities. And also very excitingly, our co-author of this report is actually now a contributing author to that report. So we're very excited that, you know, there'll be more focus and of these perspectives in this plan, of this report. And our kind of vision continues to be shifting from social inclusion to participatory development, building what we call the People's Plan, kind of piece by piece, bringing it all together, where residents are really central to the design and decision making. Something we say all the time in our work is information is power. Ideally, it would have been my team here presenting instead of me, but I thought I would leave you with a short video that they made a couple years ago, kind of highlighting their plans and designs for the project. And of course, they did it in song because
My heart's a radio, it only beats for the truth. We want a station that can speak out for the youths, where our stories make the news. When we have options, we would choose to watch facts instead of fiction. Reality is no sci-fi, no green screen picture. It's our story, what do we need a script for? Don't try to sugarcoat the bitterness of being poor.
Radio, cinema, maps and society, Chicoco Collective.
When we have the space, we'll do it big. For now, we'll do it small. Great opportunity to break the wall of setback, oppression, and forced eviction. In the slum, create a space for our dreams and vision. Put ourselves in the map, be a part of the city. People live here, we want to live free.
Yeah.
We want to live free.
Chicoco, radio, cinema, maps and society, Chicoco Collective.
You know, nothing is a waste if it can be managed. The higher the carbon, more risks to the climate. Clean up our world, one plastic at a time. Chicoco music to the world, a story in a song. When we got the space, we do it big, now let's do it small. People live here and we want to be free.
Radio, cinema, maps and society, Chicoco Collective.
Chicoco Collective, supported by CIMA.
so yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So that was wonderful. A couple of things to note: when you're asking questions, please get a microphone, because this is on Zoom, and so we need to always be speaking into the mic, and introduce yourself and then ask your question. And the other thing is that Barbara has agreed to do a talk-back session in room 105 afterwards at 2, and so you can ask questions about this and also maybe about her path from Cornell to this and other aspects of her work, which is, as Linda pointed out, quite extensive. So with that, questions?
Hello, my name is Manon. First of all, thank you so much for such an engaged and amazing presentation. I actually have a couple of questions. The first one is kind of related to like your reputation, or the reputation of the collective with the like local government. I see obviously you're doing a lot of work with like community, and there's been involvement with like police representatives, but just kind of like wondering how that works, because at the start you showed that one of the billboards got taken down in 24 hours, so like how that works.
Yeah. Do you have more, or do you want me to answer that?
I do have more questions. I could just throw them all out at you right now, or?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, sure. And then kind of building off of that, seeing that you have the kind of like community space, or I loved how you put it, the learning garden, kind of wondering where it actually sits in the waterfront and whether or not it faces any like fear of retribution, or like part of like if it's in one of those communities that's at risk of like being demoed. So like, I guess navigating that. And then also if you anticipate, or you all anticipate like pushback for like future renovations So yeah, it's all related to kind of, I guess, like the reputation with the government and that relationship.
Yeah, I was expecting a question on this, but this is actually something we work hard at, is making sure that we do always engage the government, no matter what we do. In Nigeria, it's a federalist system, so all of the kind of urban powers sit within the state government, just for example. And we've had variously engaged and interested or not. We are kind of really lucky that we sit in this kind of intermediary space where we actually have quite a good relationship with some people in the government, not all. And at various points, we did have a task force actually within the Ministry of Urban Development, kind of meeting, monthly on issues. And there's not a lot of capacity, so they often kind of call us when there's a lot going on, or visitors of things, which is really interesting. And I think the fact that we have been there since 2009, we are one of the few entities that kind of continues to exist in this space. So we are really well known as this kind of able to move between the community and government. With that said, we do often have confrontations a lot, but it shifts, and it's very politicized, with who's appointed and things. One thing that we have done is make sure that we engage with the civil servants and build those relationships, because the leadership changes all the time. Actually, in River State right now, there's actually been a state of emergency for 6 months, so there's not really a government, which is interesting, which is actually an interesting dynamic, but not a lot has changed on ground. We've had to adapt in certain ways. So one thing that we always do is say, if we wait for the government, nothing will happen. So we are trying to do and work on kind of these distributed piloting things, and always bring the government in. Hold them accountable, and if they want to take credit for things, we say, great. That is actually even better, because that will, create more accountability and bring them along. So we are always kind of sometimes begrudgingly bringing them into things, but it's always a thing we're challenging to navigate a lot. And to kind of the second question about the space. I would say the community where that is built is actually one of the few sand-filled communities, so it actually is easier to build on, first of all, to build a structure. It's a little bit more secure. Different waterfront communities are kind of at risk in different ways. At certain points, all communities have been at risk. This is a little bit more secure one, and there's been kind of long debates about how we engage and make sure we're not focusing just on this community. And it is kind of down at the waterfront. It helped that the community did decide to actually donate this land and recognized it, but we often are trying to check in with them, and we have like a standing MOU with the leadership and kind of engage in this process of making sure that they are involved. There's a lot of really interesting engagement dynamics in this region, especially with all of the oil industry, where they kind of have these community liaison officers who just go out and literally pay communities to be quiet and allow them to continue the work. That's created really interesting dynamics where people say, what do you have for me? And you can't really blame them because of what has been done. So there's a lot of challenges to kind of shift them to take ownership of this. And that's been a lot of process, actually. I think I rambled there a little bit on your response, but.
Great.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sandy. I'm a second-year MRP student. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very inspiring to me. So my question is, how do you feel about the connection between the MRP program and the meaningful work you are doing right now? The skills learned in the program, how they are benefiting you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting because I am our only permanent planner working on this project, which at times is very scary. There's times where I'm like, I'm not qualified to be doing all of this, but there's a lot of kind of flying by the seat of your pants and making things. And I think doing this and doing a lot of training and capacity building has definitely made me reflect a lot more about the things I learned in this program. I did kind of an intro to planning training to kind of shift, and there was a challenge getting our team to think about just collecting the data to how do we use it and how do we engage with the community and kind of what now. And this was a big shift in our program of being very reactionary to now being, proposing new ideas and trying to shift dynamics. So that was a time where we were rethinking, and I remember when I was teaching the training, I actually went a lot back to the planning, intro to planning course, and was thinking about those simple things. One class that I always wish, I don't think it's taught anymore, but I wish I had taken was kind of John Forrester used to teach a negotiation and power class, and I actually, now I realize how important those pieces are. I view a lot of our work as kind of intermediaries and bringing people together, and there are a lot of power dynamics in all of this, even within the community. We always say, don't fetishize the community, because they are just as flawed as the government in ways that they think, and who is empowered and represented and things like that. But those are a few, but I think definitely trying to teach other people what they're doing and engaging made me think a lot more about my experience.
Oh, hello, I'm Taryn. Thank you for your talk. It's been really inspiring hearing about your work and the work you do with Chicoco. My question is, as a community-based organization focused on storytelling and talking about documenting people's daily struggles, how do you build trust and relationality with the stakeholders, especially in the beginning when you're starting projects, so that they feel comfortable actually engaging with the organization?
Yeah, I think that trust is really important, and there's various times we're challenged a lot in different ways of that. One thing I think that helps, whether we're doing our data collection, is that I'm not out there doing that. One, I change the dynamics of all of that, but they're actually, whenever we enter a community, we actually engage with community members from that community to be part of that process. So there's a lot more you recognize and feel comfortable with your neighbors, people that are from there that are actually really engaging in that. But it is an ongoing struggle, I would say, especially over the years. And I think one thing is that people have seen us there in the darkest of times in these kind of forced evictions, and we're still there. And we continue to be there, and that has been a huge thing, that continuity. They know us, they come to us on various things, but there's, it's always a challenge that we're trying to figure out. And as I said, these dynamics are really challenging in these spaces of, especially outsiders coming in, but a big thing is having, we have long-time community activists that lead our community engagement process. So they know these dynamics. We do not just enter a community ever. We spend a lot of time going through processes of kind of formalizing these and recognizing what needs to be said or done. Sometimes we have to drink sodas and just sitting with residents a lot. I know when I'm there, I do a lot of spending time just at the local pubs, and that recognizes me down in the waterfronts as someone who's like them, and that they're more comfortable with me. So there's a lot of little things, I think, that build it than just one big thing. But it's always a struggle.
Thanks, Barbara. This is awesome. My name is Matt, and I love development economics and kind of this scene. My question is kind of piggybacking off of what you just said, and I was kind of curious by the statement you made about low crime. I thought that was really interesting, and I was curious why you thought that was. To me, it almost signaled tight social networks and tight communities. I wasn't sure if that's the case, but I was curious as to why you guys found that was the case, and whether you think your initiatives have helped make the initiative, or have communities make the initiative stronger since there's such tight social networks, or vice versa, that your initiatives make the community stronger?
Yeah, it is. I think that it is. Yes, there is low crime because These are actually in the city are some of the most communal spaces. And most of these communities have strong ties to different tribal groups, and they have very complex systems of community leadership. They have elected leaders. At various times, different tribes are empowered more by who they're tied to in government leadership and things like that. And there's also great wide diversity within these communities. They are not a monolith in any way. Some are, have block structures and more planned versus others that have less ties to community leadership and are less, together and maybe have slightly different. So there is wide range of things. There is certainly still a lot of, gang, or they call it cult groups that are active in these communities. And these are spaces that we definitely have to deal with. Some of them might create quite safe spaces. Actually, where our shed is actually between two cult group lands, and we're quite safe most of the time, but every once in a while they clash. So you have to kind of, so there definitely is crime, but because they have their own security groups, some of these communities literally they have like several main gates they lock at night, and people will often say they moved into these spaces for safety, and their neighbors watch them and things like that, which is very different from some of the less, upland areas that don't have those ties. But it's definitely a mixed bag. I always say about Port Harcourt, all the stories are true, but you could definitely lead a life oblivious to a lot of them because you may not see things. But I'd say they'll try people in the community, or they try and keep the crime out of their community. So there is, a lot that they're working on in that way. So it's a mixed bag and complicated, but kind of your day-to-day crime is actually pretty low, I think.
Hi. I really would like to. Hi, I'm Neha. So I'd really like to appreciate your presentation because it was quite interesting the way participatory design works. So going back to the demolition time, so I wanted to ask, how did the government justify this demolition? Because now that you're saying that the day-to-day crime rate is very less here, because majority of the time globally, these demolitions are many a times classified because of the crime rate and the illegal activities that take place in these built forms. So how did the government justify?
Yeah, someone once referred to me some of the views on demolishing communities, or even there's often, again, street traders. Someone once referred to me as kind of this straight from the head thinking. They're like, I hate to say that, I think this happened recently in DC, similar thinking, but that they see something that looks dirty and not organized. Actually, they're usually very organized, and so we need to get rid of it. It's this kind of immediate response in that way. I also think there is kind of this stuck in the City Beautiful movement in planning in some ways, of saying we need to modernize, beautify, remove all of these things, but really divorced from, a lot of times when they demolish markets, the main market in Port Harcourt, every year or so they go in and demolish it and it comes right back. And the irony is that, in the government center, the governor's house, his food is likely coming from that market. So there's kind of this disconnect in ways, and this idea of just no long-term thinking in a lot of these things. And there's a lot of development projects like that are just kind of done without no data collection, no asking communities and things like that. So in that way, they kind of justify, and I've seen it actually, there's just been some meetings recently with the Greater Port Harcourt Task Force, which was the group that put out that plan originally. And they are working on some new plans, and they still do think that they are improving conditions. They see, and I say people in these communities, they want to improve their conditions. They're not, perfectly happy with their sanitation, with spaces they want to live. And they really do think that we need to put up, demolish them and put up new housing. But there's a lot of disconnect about how to do that properly. So there's this weird kind of rationalization in that way of people really thinking they're doing good. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just land grabs in ways, but there is kind of this challenge, and those conversations are difficult because they think they are right and they are working to improve things. So how do you kind of keep pushing them? And a lot of that has been, most of these people haven't stepped inside one of these communities, so they still have this very backwards view of it. So one way is trying to kind of like bring people in. And as I was saying, through the encounter exchange, those events, if they happen at a big fancy hotel. And there's big protocols and things, so just having people in there and looking around and understanding and kind of reducing those power dynamics of how they engage on issues changes things a lot. But it's a challenge, and it's we'll see.
There's like a slight sense of disgust that comes from these places, which drives it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm an undergraduate in urban and regional studies. I'm wondering, with all of the extensive change you guys have made in the community connections and all of the projects you guys have, where do you guys obtain funding for that, and what are some challenges you face with that?
Absolutely. Probably one of our greatest challenges is the funding issue. And, you know, we do always have our spaces that we're moving and making sure we try and definitely get a lot of grant funding. We've done, you know, early on we had some big funding from Cities Alliance, from big NGOs or GIZ or various kind of multinational funding organizations. But it's a real challenge. We always try and get projects that kind of work towards our continuous process. But it's every funder wants to have their project that has outcomes and, you know, complicated reporting processes. So it's often a challenge to kind of bring all these together and continue to be working. And, you know, it's definitely a real challenge to get at this point in the project, our biggest funding, or money we need is for our core costs. You know, renting spaces, electricity, and things like that. Or we've now shifted from our participants where came in as just, you know, they got a small stipend and food for each training and activity they participated in. And that's actually much more budget friendly to the big organizations. And now we've shifted to wanting to eventually that they take over everything. And we started with monthly stipends, hoping to kind of shift them fully to be full-time staff. And that is a real challenge in kind of this funding landscape. No one wants to pay staff. And we have been lucky to get some unrestricted funding from a few big donors, which has been huge. And we have some big, hopefully some big funding coming through soon. I can't speak too much on it. And also shifting more to doing more technical assistance projects, especially with the mapping team. They can be doing more things like the World Bank, fecal sludge management project, or we've reached a point where we can be kind of training or doing things outside of just Port Harcourt. So it's a real challenge. That is probably one of our greatest challenges. It's kind of continuing all of this is, but we're hopeful and have some big projects hopefully coming down, more focused on kind of climate adaptation and things like that. But always making sure everything we take is heading towards our goals. And that's a piece that, you know, may kind of jog a little here and there, but making sure that it does kind of bring together in that way.
Hi, I'm Natalie Jones. I'm a second year historic preservation planning master's student. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very, you know, I love learning about places that I've never been to, and just, you know, all the ways that, you know, people help in different capacities. I was just wondering, in terms of sort of the creative social infrastructure programs that you're that seem wildly successful, do you ever have pushback in terms of people who are having a difficult time maybe wanting to create or be creative? And, you know, I guess sort of in terms of gaining trust, what are ways that you can sort of, because you do work with the government and that might be, you know, very unpopular with some. Have you faced a lot of pushback in terms of people who are hesitant to, you know, access the programs or anything like that?
Yeah, definitely, in a number of different ways. I will say it's always interesting. We get a lot of people that come into our project through the music program. And that is probably the kind of main way that people enter. Early on, it was just the journalism. And we'll have people enter who maybe have studied journalism, or a number of people that have no experience whatsoever. One of my kind of oldest mappers came in. He was a community elder, actually, in the community, and he's now about 70. He came to us a few years ago just kind of wanting to learn, which was very exciting. And he's one of our, contributes a lot in different ways. And we do have a lot of different skill levels. And that's something that, as we're kind of solidifying into, more of a self-run entity, is how do we continue to make space for those people that may have, no skills in that way, but are still really valuable. And so that is, luckily in our cohort, there's still this kind of core belief that we are a community project and we need to include everyone. So they kind of drive a lot of that too, but it's a dynamic, and everyone wants to be in the band, but not everyone can be. But it's funny, I have a lot of people that come in, I always say that they're rappers and mappers, which has created some really fun songs. Not your average way, but a lot of people are actually involved in a lot of the different programs that are, they're creating journalist programs, and they're part of the mapping team. And, but there are things that we have to be cautious of. We push a lot of buttons in our work, but there's certain things that we kind of have to be cautious of. It's a very religious space. In the southern Nigeria is very Christian, evangelical Christian, so there's a lot of people that are uncomfortable with certain things. And we work a lot that in our cohort, a lot of gender dynamics are something we have to work a lot with and challenge within our cohort, of how they view and see things. It's a very patriarchal space. So that's something that we work with. And it's been a complicated process to get our kind of commercial radio license, and that has to go through very formal processes. So there's things that we have to be cautious of around like LGBTQ issues. We are very open in that space, but we have to be cautious about what we put out on that for now. We hope that we can kind of be more progressive in that, but there are some things that we have to be careful of. I would say in Nigeria there is, I always say Nigerians are very aggressively friendly, very open to debate, and so there is, despite being some real, lockdowns and pressure on things, you are able to be kind of openly critical in a lot of ways. There's things, and a lot of our local team will raise things. They're like, if we say this in this article, we do not want the retribution from the governor, and saying we're, coming after him on something. So there is a lot that goes into kind of that editorial process of thinking about the international audience and then really locally how people will feel. So it's complicated.
Can I take a couple questions? Is that okay? First of all, fecal sludge management, so important. You have no idea.
Yeah.
And if you want to ever talk about FSM, I'm totally with you. I have two questions. One and both build on some of the earlier conversations. One is that I think the Chicoco project is so lovely because it is not traditionally planned how planning goes. You're really blending the arts and storytelling, multimedia, and planning, the rappers and the mappers together. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how you think, what the students here should take away about planning methods moving forward, because the way we teach planning, the courses that we offer here are very rational, very data-oriented, very methodical, and it does not really have too much that is the rapping and the creative arts, which is really what engages and brings people in. So how have you seen those other methods really get people motivated and engaged and connected, and what does that mean for people who are doing their studies? Should they go learn and take a media class or something else like that? My other question is, you started talking about climate adaptation, and I'm looking at the spaces on these maps, and they're all along the waterways on the waterfronts. And so I completely see that there's all these issues of they have to be first understood legitimately, as legitimate places deserving of alternative housing if we were ever going to talk about a voluntary, different kind of a plan. So we cannot talk about relocation because that part of legitimacy is not built in. But I wondered if you could speak to, if not the government, as you say, there is no long-term planning, but in the minds of the communities that you work with, as they're thinking about the long term of this Delta region and storms and all these things, what is their vision for what that future means for them? Does it mean elevating and staying in situ? Does it mean relocating? Does it mean something else? And what's that conversation like?
Yes, both great questions. On the kind of media and communication and the creative side, I mean, there's definitely times that I've been challenged, as I don't come from the creative side. I luckily, a few of my colleagues do. Our project director is a documentary filmmaker in training, and he's produced some, great documentaries that kind of focused on kind of challenging a lot of narratives and rethinking things and using kind of storytelling to kind of challenge people in the way that they're thinking. And we also have people that have worked for years, decades at the BBC, luckily working with us. So for me, it's definitely been challenging. I definitely didn't come from this side. I have no musical talent whatsoever. So at times I'm definitely challenged of I want to just go and do things. But I have found this to be, this idea of communicating and how we do it, and different ways of engaging people and creating dialogue, and getting creative with that, and has been really important. I also say there's always a lot of different organizations doing, equally, amazing, even if better work than us, but they're not good at telling their story or engaging. And so that's something that I have learned a lot about, is the importance of being able to tell the story. And giving people different ways to engage, and music matters a lot, more than we think about, and how a way of engaging, and different ways that people respond to an image, or that they culturally are tied to different ways. So I would definitely recommend thinking about and how you bring people together in more creative ways of creating spaces and public spaces and engaging, I think is incredibly important. And there's a lot of different ways, and tying it to what kind of locally is important to people. I don't know, that was kind of a ramble response on that, but I definitely think it's incredibly important, something I've learned a lot from, and probably took for granted before, is a lot of these creative ways of doing it. Yeah, and your second question, remind me again, sorry. Oh, climate adaptation. Yeah, a huge, huge issue. I do a lot of other work, consulting work on climate adaptation in other places in the world too, and it's a huge, huge issue. People, when you talk to them, they're very aware of what's happening. They may not be able to use the exact language that maybe we do in this space, but they'll talk about, floods are getting worse, how they're coping with heat and things like that. So they're very hyper aware and thinking about it. We have a strong take that we want to keep things in situ. We do not want to remove people from the communities, but, and they are feeling it. There are places where the boreholes are becoming brackish and salty. All the water around there is, brackish and salty. So, water is increasingly hard issue. And I always find the future of Nigeria, climate change-wise, terrifying. You have kind of the Sahel creeping up from the desert, from the north, and as well sea level rise, and as well water disappearing. It's terrifying. And Nigeria is supposed to be, by 2050, the third most populous country in the world. So it's a terrifying future in ways. But we do have some big works that we're trying to work with on kind of solar mini grid projects that hopefully will happen in the waterfronts. Part of our take is if you need to do anything, do it in this space. And that will kind of build, this is the trickiest space probably in Nigeria with the oil. with environmental degradation and starting to kind of build that demand and change there. But flooding is probably one of the biggest concerns. They already are living with regular floods. You know, anytime it rains, and there's issues with the infrastructure, there's no kind of, they put in big new drains upland, and of course that funnels all of the area into certain communities. So trying to build in that kind of system thinking about how these interact and engage. There was one of the communities that we are primarily based in, they had a huge big flooding because of that exact issue of them channeling more water into their community. And so they're like, we need to deal with this. We need to widen our drainage canal. We need to deal with this. And we did see them, they went in and demolished a bunch of the structures along that canal with kind of no warning or compensation, you know, exactly the same as what the government does with some of those same issues. So there is still that same thinking in the community. And there is a lot more of it. People are coping at the household scale, but not as much bringing it to the community scale and figuring out kind of solutions. We do see some where they'll build like berms to kind of keep the floods or put up nets to deal with those flooding issues that people are already doing. So a lot of what we want to do is kind of continue to build on that, engage, and kind of think what can they do in these spaces. Recognize that they are probably one of the most at-risk, you know, spaces for this. There's not an easy answer, but something that we want to, we're actively really working on.
Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm the second year MLP student. I'm wondering that for such informal residential area, I would assume there will be some sort of self-governing like groups, and as you mentioned before, like there are some tribes have some sort of control over different neighborhoods. So I'm wondering, like, how does this leadership change or adapt after this project, this whole program was introduced? Especially with now you are bringing more and more people into this decision procedure, and like how do you keep on their good side? Because I'm assuming that you won't always agree or be positive with everything you proposed. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, as I was, you know, the waterfronts are definitely, as I said, not a monolith. They have their own internal dynamics and issues between them. Even in some of our rapid profiling mapping, we've discovered that there are actually land disputes. You know, one community will say this is their boundary, these houses are in theirs, and another community will say this is theirs. And so we're like, well, what do we do? How do we record this boundary? And one way of that is trying, okay, we are not there to solve their problems. We are kind of remaining this neutral entity of bringing them together to kind of look at this and see if they can solve. That's a very spatial way, but there are also, you know, huge dynamics of the leaderships or between different tribes. There's often, you know, two major tribes that kind of claim they own Port Harcourt, going back to kind of the 1913 agreement with the British. So there's complex dynamics. The more that I'm there, the more I realize how complex they are, and different tribes that have more power than others. So there is a lot of, we have to work within these leadership structures, kind of getting agreement. If we don't, they could thwart everything we're doing. So we often are challenged of how do we continue to work with them, but also shift those dynamics. Or they're also, you know, we've had a lot of issues with, you know, doing a focus group where we ask the community to send 10 women. And it's very different if they send their spouses, their people that they are representative of their husband. Those discussions and things we learn are totally different than we kind of go and try and organize it slightly under different ways. We saw that in our sanitation work where we had, you know, some of them were the wives of the chairman and they weren't able to say much, but in another one, they were there, and as soon as the men left and it was only women, we were able to have, you know, very juicy discussions, like critical of the community engagement and about real women issues. So there's ways that kind of trying to work with both and navigate. and also trying to be really aware of what's happening. They have elections. In actually the one community we're mapping now, it's been slow because they have had dueling community leadership. And so how do you go through both of those of like, we are the elected ones, or other people. So it slowed us down a lot in that way, and trying to not kind of step on those toes. And also that community, there's been, I think for like 15 years, plans to build a long bridge from there. So this idea of this development coming challenges those dynamics and who's vying to be part of that and how that's represented. So there's a lot of that, and we have to kind of stop and check in a lot. We always say is like, don't muddle through. Like if we hit these issues, let's stop, rethink about what we do, engage with our, community engagement team, and also kind of build more people that can do that kind of work.
I wanted to ask a question and sort of make a comment, but I wanted to follow up on that because I think it's a really important point of how do you know when to stop? The other observation I was going to make is it can be simplistic to point to colonial heritage as being a source of a lot of this, but when you think about the process of othering and the ability for one group to find another group disgusting, it reminds me of things like what happened to Old Delhi under the British in the 19th century. The smells of the city obviously must mean it's unhealthy, and so we got to get rid of it, and it's unfortunate to see the same kind of traditions of movement happening even in places that are post-colonial. But back to the other question of like, what are the triggers and how do you know to stop and pull back when you're really invested in moving forward?
Yeah. And I don't think we have we don't have set like things on that. And I think part of it is we are so embedded in the community. We are very aware, or have people that will raise these flags for us. And it can be very challenging to stop. And we've had to stop mapping certain communities because there's been security concerns, things erupt, or things that could really challenge what is being done. And when things, doing things can be problematic. And I think that's a really important thing to know in any work is like, I don't think we have a set, and as me, I'm a white girl from Cleveland. Like, there's things that I need to make sure that I am recognizing where I always say in this work, if I'm not continually questioning what I'm doing there, I need to get the hell out of there. And that is a very important thing of kind of knowing how, and there's there'll be certain points I've reached that at times, and recognizing kind of your other, even within our team of like, maybe they have different ideas about this community than the community, or they have their own narratives and things. And I think one thing that is trying to keep open discussion on that people can raise flags, always, and that say, and there's always this push to kind of just muddle and do. As Nigerians say, just manage. And that's something that we are constantly having to pull people back. Actually, a lot of my work is pulling people back and say, stop, like, think twice, that saying of, think twice, write once, and like, make sure you're doing it right the first time, or do we need more information? And when the community wants us to come in, but we know that it's not actually safe for these other reasons. So it's a really important thing, I think, to know when to stop. And there's a lot of, these are some things, there are a lot of things we've had to stop or abandon or shift. But I think compared to some other organizations that work in Port Harcourt, we're so local and small in that way, is that we are able to shift and adapt quite easily. During the this recent state of emergency, we had to stop for a minute and say, we need to stop our programs before we can understand what this means locally. how does this security-wise? We stopped our drone flying program for a while because we were very concerned about how that would be viewed. We were able to kind of start it again, but I think being flexible on that is, again, it's not, I don't know, there's no set answer, but I think that's kind of part of the answer, is that you need to be adaptable and ready to stop and say, wait a second, let's think about this.
Yeah, I think listening and being willing to hear things you didn't necessarily want to hear,
yeah,
is important.
Thank you so much. I'm Della Alderson. I'm a second-year MRP, and I focus on spaces for women's leisure. And so I'm just really interested in what sort of design choices and programming choices, besides the very cool event that you mentioned, you're making in this space.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a tough one to do. As I said, most of these spaces are, even when we built the existing shed, it's still, who do you see in that space? It's men playing drafts or checkers, or young children playing. And it is a real challenge to kind of create those spaces, because women, exist in private spaces. Spaces are unsafe. I think we've done a lot within our existing cohort to kind of shift how women view, and there's kind of a ripple effect in that way. It's kind of a starting point. With our renovation next, there's some big things that we're trying to do in terms of gardening and bringing in some powerful community women as well, and to kind of push things forward in ways. There's this fabulous woman in the community next to us. Her name is Madame Shortnicker, because she was a founder of that community, and she's named that because she continues to wear shorts when it's not as socially acceptable as older women to do, and she's real sassy, and she's creating her own gardening for her own food. So kind of bringing in people like that to kind of take ownership of those spaces and challenge it. But yeah, I mean, I constantly have even making sure we have enough women involved and engaged is always a space of saying, we kind of need to push to have a certain number of women, or else they won't be there necessarily in certain ways. So it's a continuous issue. And I said there before, there is this dynamic often of if you're in public, you are representing your husband and you're speaking on his behalf, is a real challenge. So creating these safe spaces, and something in all of our focus groups or discussions, making sure that there are only women. It sounds simple, but it doesn't happen a lot always, of it's only women recording. It's only women asking the questions. It's a safe place where people can't hear, so that they can actually be critical and engage. Very simple things, but creating kind of those safe spaces to call those things out, and so they don't disappear. But thinking a lot about safety in spaces. One thing that we hope in this next space is to create kind of a laundry area and cooking area that will kind of organically push for more women in these spaces and shift those dynamics that don't seem crazy, but they are actually, there is no space like that for them to gather. And we've hosted a few Women's Day events where, women came, and one woman I remember saying, she's like, I didn't know there was a day for women, but now that I know March 8th is, Women's Day, I'm gonna celebrate it every year, and trying to have, dedicated. There's always times you'll get pushback when people will say, oh, where's the men's only group? And you're like, well, that's every other group. So one step forward, one step back, I think, in a number of ways.
I just want to say a huge thank you. How totally inspiring, from your own T-shirt to the T-shirts there, from the power of graphics, information, data, doing, the subtlety of how you've engaged. Yeah. Sorry, I was just excited, not actually raising my hand, but if I can kick off the thank you, and actually how inspiring to hear someone who, this is 10 years ago, you were literally sitting here, or 12 years ago. Yeah. But let me hand over to Linda to do the closing. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Jeff.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful kickoff for our entire lecture series. I hope you are super inspired by what you have heard. And if you are interested in the specific ways, especially that Barbara has taken to go from place to place so that how did she end up from Lakewood, Ohio to Port Harcourt, Nigeria, please join us for the talk back in room 106? 105. Huh? Okay, 105 or 106. And if you have not signed the sign-in sheet here, please do so. It'll be up at the front. Thanks again. Let's give Barbara a big welcome. Thank you.
And just shameless plug, feel free to go to our Viral Times platform at chicoco.fm for a lot more stories and music and videos.